Somewhere in a forgotten archive, on a piece of newsprint, so old the edges have turned the color of weak tea, there is a small article, 3 columns wide, a headline that reads, in the strange, dignified type of the late 1800s, that the bones of a giant have been uncovered. A farmer was ploughing a field, a railway crew was cutting into a hill, a boy was digging a swimming hole at the edge of a creek, and what came out of the ground was a femur longer than a fence post, a jawbone wide enough to fit around the head of a normal man, a row of teeth in double, as if the mouth had been built for a different kind of eating. The article runs for perhaps 400 words. It names the witnesses. It gives the dimensions in feet and inches. It says the bones were sent to a museum in the East and that the museum had received them, and that experts would examine them. And then the article ends, and nothing more is ever said. No follow-up, no display, no catalogue number, no photograph. The bones simply enter the building and never come out. If you go looking, you will find that this same article exists in dozens, in hundreds, in some counts more than 1,500 small newspapers across the United States and Canada and parts of Europe, all printed between roughly 1840 and 1920. Different counties, different farmers, different railway crews, different swimming holes, but the same shape of story, again and again and again. Bones too large for any man we know, sent away, lost. We are told now that none of it was real, that the editors were lying or were lied to, that the bones were animal bones, or stones, or nothing at all. And maybe that is true. Maybe 1,000 farmers and 100 newspapers and dozens of county sheriffs all made the same mistake at the same time, in the same way, with the same measurements. Maybe. But there is another possibility, a quieter one. The possibility that the bones were exactly what the article said they were. That a generation of very large people once walked to the surface of this planet. That their remains were collected, very carefully, very methodically, and removed from public view. That somebody, somewhere, did not want us to know. Tonight we are going to take a long, slow walk through that possibility. We are going to visit the places where the giants are said to have lived, and the places where they are said to have died, and we are going to look at what is left. And we are going to ask, in the gentlest possible voice, where did they go? So get comfortable. Dim the light. Settle in. We have a long, quiet journey ahead of us. If this is the kind of story that helps you settle into sleep, the kind of slow, wandering walk through forgotten places that lets your mind unwind from the day, then take a moment now, before we go too far, to subscribe to the channel and ring the little bell. It costs you nothing. It tells the algorithm that this is the kind of place you want to come back to. And it means that on nights when you cannot sleep, when the ceiling fan is the only thing speaking, you will find a new story, like this one, waiting for you. Subscribed listeners are the only reason a channel like this can keep going. The research, the writing, the slow, careful voice in the dark. It all rests on the small kindness of a tap on a button. So if you have a moment, do that now, and then come back. We have a long way to walk. The world we are told about is a world of medium-sized people, roughly the same height for tens of thousands of years. Slight changes, a few inches here, a few inches there, dependent on diet, on climate, on luck. The skeletons we are shown in museums are skeletons of that medium-sized person. The clothing in the old tombs is the clothing of that medium-sized person. The doorways in the very old houses are doorways for that medium-sized person, sometimes a little shorter, because the ceilings were low and the heat needed to stay near the body. That is the story we are told. But all around the edges of that story, in the footnotes, in the discarded newspaper morgues, in the locked drawers of certain museums, in the oral histories of certain peoples, there is another story. A story of a different kind of human. Taller, heavier, older. a people whose bones, when they are found, are described in numbers that do not fit any chart. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet, 10, in some accounts, 12, in a few accounts, 14 or more. And these accounts are not from one place. They are from everywhere. From the high plains of North America, from the deserts of the Southwest, from the islands of the Pacific, from the cold rocks of the Aleutians, from the green valleys of Ireland, from the dry stones of Malta, from the high passes of the Caucasus, from the red soil of Central Australia, from the cloud forests of the Andes. Everywhere people have lived long enough to remember things, they remember giants. And so tonight, we are going to make a list, very slowly, very gently, of the places where the last of these large people are said to have lived. And we are going to think about how and why they vanished. Not all at once, not in a single bright moment, but over generations, in different ways, in different places. Some by disease, some by drowning, some by war, some by simple disappearance into the hills and the caves. Some, perhaps, by nothing more than the slow erasure of memory. We have a list of 15 places, 15 names, 15 quiet endings. Let your mind settle. We will take our time with each one. Number 1. Lovelock Cave, Nevada. If you drive northeast out of Reno along the old highway, through the kind of high desert country where the sagebrush goes silver in the afternoon and the road shimmers with heat even in the cool months, you will eventually come to a small town called Lovelock. The town is named for an Englishman who set up a station there in the 1860s to water the wagons going west. The town is small, a few streets, a courthouse with a round shape that gives it the look of a sleeping animal. And about 20 miles east of the town, in the side of a low brown mountain, there is a cave. The cave is not large by cave standards. The entrance is high and dark, and the floor goes back perhaps 50 yards into the rock before it begins to narrow. For most of the 20th century, no one paid the cave much attention. But in 1911, 2 men working for a guano mining company entered the cave to harvest bat droppings for fertilizer. They went in with shovels and lamps, and they began to dig down through the layers of accumulated bat dust on the floor. And what they found, under the dust, was a layer of bones, human bones. And the bones were not the size of the bones in the local cemetery. The skulls were longer, the jaws were heavier. The leg bones were the kind of leg bones you could not get your hand around. And the hair on the heads of the better preserved remains was red. Not the red of an Irishman or a Scotsman, a deeper red, the red of old copper. Long red hair, woven in places into mats and sandals. The miners did not know what to make of it. They reported the find. The University of California sent people. Materials were collected, boxed, labeled, sent away. And the cave was opened to looters, who took what they could carry, and to amateur diggers, who took more. And much of what came out of the cave was lost, broken, scattered into private collections, melted down for the value of the cloth, or simply forgotten. But the Paiute people of the area already had a name for the people who had once lived in the cave. They called them the Site-Ka, the tool eaters, the reedy ones, the cannibals. And in the old Paiute stories, the Site-Ka were a different kind of people, taller than the Paiute, lighter in skin, rayed of hair, hostile to all neighbors. And in the stories, the Paiute and their allies had fought a long war against the Site-Ka, a war that ended when the last of the giants were driven into a cave, and the entrance was sealed with brush and lit on fire, and the cave became their tomb. The story is older than the mining company. The story is older than the railroad. The story is older than the town. It was told around fires for many generations before any white man set foot in the Humboldt Sink. And when the bat dust was scraped away in 1911, what was found under the dust fit the story. Long, red hair, tall bones, a people not us. The university quietly accepted the materials, A few of the skulls were photographed in black and white, with rulers laid alongside the jaws to show the scale. And then most of the materials disappeared from public access. A few survive in display cases in the small museum at the Lovelock Courthouse and at the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca. You can go and look at them. The skulls are large, the jaws are heavy. The hair, what remains of it, is the color of old fire. And in the visitor book at the museum, people leave small notes. They write that they came because their grandmother told them about it. They write that they came because they read about it on the internet. They write that they came because they wanted to see, with their own eyes, the proof of something that should not, by everything we are told, exist. And then they go home, and the desert goes back to being quiet, and the cave sits in the side of the mountain, and the wind moves through it, and somewhere under the floor, in places no one has yet dug, there may be more of them, sleeping, waiting, or just gone. Number 2. The Adena Mound Builders of the Ohio Valley. If you drive north out of Charleston, West Virginia, and follow the Kanawha River as it bends through the wooded hills toward the Ohio, you will pass, on the right side of the road, near a town called South Charleston, a low green hill. The hill is round. It is about 35 feet high. It is covered in grass, and a single tree grows near its summit. From a distance, it looks like nothing. It looks like a swelling of the earth. It looks like a place where a small child might roll down on a Sunday afternoon. But the hill is not a hill. It is a mound. It was built by hands. It was raised, basket of earth by basket of earth, over the course of many years, by a people we now call the Adena. The Adena lived in the Ohio Valley from roughly 1000 BC to 100 AD. They built mounds, hundreds of them, some round, some long, some shaped like animals, like the Great Serpent at Serpent Mound, which winds along a ridge in southern Ohio in a slow, uncoiling line a quarter-mile long. The Adena were not a small people, in either sense of the word. Their territory covered most of present-day Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and parts of Indiana and Pennsylvania. And inside their mounds, when those mounds were opened, in the 1800s and the early 1900s, by farmers and amateur archaeologists, and finally by the Smithsonian Institution itself, the bodies that were found were not the bodies of small people. They were the bodies of large people. The South Charleston Mound, the one beside the road, was excavated in 1883 by a team from the Smithsonian. The director of the dig, a man named Colonel P.W. Norris, wrote his report. The report exists. It is in the archives. And in the report, Colonel Norris describes finding, near the center of the mound, a vault built of timber and stone. Inside the vault was a single skeleton. The skeleton, by his measurements, was 7 feet 6 inches in length. The bones were heavy. The skull was robust. Around the body were copper bracelets and shell beads, and pieces of mica cut into the shape of birds. Colonel Norris recorded everything. The body was collected. The artifacts were collected. They were sent east to Washington, to the Smithsonian, for further study. And there the trail ends. The skeleton does not appear in any subsequent Smithsonian publication. It is not on display. It is not in the public catalogue. When you ask the Smithsonian where it is, they say, in a polite and careful tone, that they do not know, or that the records are incomplete, or that the specimen may have been lost in a transfer. The report exists. The body does not. And the South Charleston Mound is one example. Across the Ohio Valley, dozens of Adena mounds were opened in the same period. Many of them contained, near the central vault, the skeleton of a single tall individual, 7 feet, 7 feet 6, 8 feet. The smaller burials around the edges of the mound were of normal-sized people. But the central burial, the honored burial, the burial that the whole mound had been built to enclose, was almost always larger, as if the people who built the mound were burying a chief, or a king, or a priest, who came from a different lineage than the rest. A taller lineage, an older lineage. The kind of lineage that, in many cultures, is described as the lineage of giants. The Adena themselves did not write. They did not leave us their own word for what they were. We do not know what they called the tall ones in the center of the mounds. We can only stand outside the mound on a quiet afternoon, with the Kanawha River moving slowly behind us, and look up at the green slope and imagine the thing that lies in its center. A vault, a body, a burial that was important enough to move a hill of earth for, and then we can drive away, and the mound stays, and the bones, wherever they are now, stay with them. Number 3. The Catalina Island Giants. About 20 miles off the coast of Southern California, in the cold blue Pacific, there is an island called Santa Catalina. It is the kind of island that looks like it should not be there. From the coast at Long Beach, on a clear day, it rises out of the haze like the back of a sleeping animal. It is rocky and dry, and the hills are covered in low brush. The interior is full of small valleys and hidden coves. There are wild bison on the island, descended from a herd left behind by a movie company in the 1920s. There are foxes that exist nowhere else in the world, and there are, or there were, the dead. In 1919, a man named Ralph Glidden, who worked in the early days of California archaeology with very little formal training but a great deal of energy, began digging on Catalina. Over the course of the next 20 years, he opened, by his own count, more than 800 burial sites on the island. He catalogued thousands of skeletons, thousands of pieces of pottery, thousands of pieces of shell and bone jewelry. And among the skeletons, he reported, were many that were unusually tall, 7 feet, some over 8. In one cave, he claimed, he found the skeleton of a man 9 feet 2 inches tall, buried with the bones of a small child held in his arms. Glidden took photographs. He built a small museum on the island, in a hut he constructed from the bones and the artifacts of his digs, a place so strange that visitors in the 1930s wrote about it as something out of a fever dream. Skulls lined the walls, femurs were used as fence posts. The whole place smelled of dust and salt and something older. Glidden was not a careful scientist. He was not a respected one. He sold his collection many times over to fund his next dig. When he died in 1968, the collection was scattered. Many of the bones were repatriated to the Tongva people, who are the indigenous people of the islands and the surrounding mainland, and who had, all along, known that their ancestors had buried people on Catalina. But not all of the bones came back. Some went to private collectors, some went to museums on the mainland, some simply disappeared. And so the official story is that Glidden was a charlatan, that his measurements were exaggerated, that the tall skeletons were no taller than the average Tongva man, who was, in fact, taller than the European settlers of the same period. The Tongva were a tall people. The men averaged 6 feet, sometimes more, in a century when the European average was 5 feet 5. So perhaps the giants of Catalina are simply this, a people taller than their conquerors, photographed in black and white, beside men who were not as tall, with rulers held at angles that flattered the bones. Perhaps. But the Tongva themselves have stories, and the stories say there were once, on the islands and along the coast, a different kind of people, taller, older, a people who came before the Tongva, and who taught the Tongva certain things, and who then went away. The stories do not say where they went, only that they went, and the island today is quiet. The wild bison move through the brush, the foxes run on the ridges, the coves are full of kelp and sea lions, and under the soil, in places that have not yet been disturbed, there may still be others, the tall ones, the first ones, waiting in their stone graves for someone to come and ask the right question. Number 4. Death Valley and the caves beneath. In the long, hot heart of the Mojave Desert, where the salt flats lie below sea level, and the summer temperatures climb past 120 degrees. There is a story that has refused to die. The story comes from the 1930s, and the man who told it, a prospector named F. Bruce Russell, wrote it down in a series of letters and gave interviews to several California newspapers. Russell claimed that while working a mine shaft in the hills near Death Valley, he had broken through into a network of tunnels. The tunnels, he said, were not natural. They had been cut. The walls were smooth. The ceilings were high. And as he and his partner, Daniel Bovey, explored, they came into a chamber, and in the chamber were the remains of a city, or at least the remains of a place where people had lived, and the people, by the bones that were still there, had been very large. Russell described skeletons 8 feet, 9 feet, even 10 feet in length. He described them lying on stone slabs, in long rows, dressed in the remains of clothing made of medium-length fur. The fur dyed in colors that no modern animal produced. He described hieroglyphs on the walls, similar, he said, to Egyptian writing, but not quite the same. He described chambers full of objects in gold, and he described all of this, in detail, to the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union and the Hot Citizen newspaper in 1947. The story was picked up by Los Angeles radio. A small expedition was organized. Russell promised to take a team back to the location. And then, in the months before the expedition was to leave, Russell disappeared. His car was found, abandoned, in the desert. His body was never found. No one was ever able to retrace his steps. The tunnels, if they existed, were never relocated, and the story slowly faded into the long list of unsolved desert mysteries that Death Valley has accumulated over the years. We are told now that Russell was a hoaxer, that his story was made up to attract investors, that the tunnels never existed. And perhaps that is so. But Death Valley is a strange place. It is full of holes that no one has mapped. There are mine shafts, abandoned in the 1880s, that descend hundreds of feet into the rock and are now blocked with collapsed timbers. There are natural caves, hollowed by water in eras when the valley was a lake. There are sinkholes that open in the salt flats without warning. The valley has swallowed many things: prospectors, wagons, children who wandered off from their families, whole expeditions in the 1840s whose only trace is a name on a creek. If Russell saw what he said he saw, the place is still there, sealed somewhere in the side of a mountain, with its rows of long bones and its hieroglyphs and its dyed fur. And the desert goes on, producing its slow, steady wind, and the salt flats glow at sunset, and somewhere under the heat, in the cool of the rock, the rumor of a buried city persists. The Paiute and Shoshone people of the Death Valley region have, like so many of the peoples we are visiting tonight, their own stories of an older race. A people who came before, who lived in the caves, who were tall and white-skinned, and who left when the climate changed and the Great Lake of the valley dried up. The stories do not match Russell's account in every detail, but they match in the shape of the thing. There was a tall people. They lived in the rock. They are no longer here. And what is left of them, if anything is left, lies somewhere in the dark, below the salt, in a place that the desert has decided to keep. Number 5. The Lompoc Giant and the Central California Coast. In 1933, a small crew of workers was digging foundations for the magazine at the Lompoc Rancho Military Reservation on a stretch of the Central California coast about 100 miles north of Los Angeles. The land there is rolling, golden in summer, green in winter, dotted with oak trees that grow in slow, heavy shapes. The crew was digging a trench. The trench was perhaps 8 feet deep, and in the side of the trench, the workers found, embedded in the soil, a skeleton. The skeleton was lying on its back. The bones were articulated. They were heavy. And by the time the supervisor of the dig had been called over to look, it was clear, even to men with no training in anatomy, that the bones did not belong to a normal-sized man. The femur was longer than the femur of any modern person. The skull was elongated, and inside the jaw were 2 rows of teeth, set in double, with the second row crowded behind the first like a shark's. The men measured the skeleton from the heel of the foot to the crown of the skull, and they came to the figure of 12 feet. 12 feet. Around the body were shells, which had been worn as ornaments. Stone tools, of a kind not known from the local Chumash people. And, strangely, a few small carved figures of what might have been animals, or might have been people, or might have been something in between. The discovery was reported in the local paper, the Lompoc Record. It was reported in the Los Angeles Times. Photographs were taken, though the photographs are now hard to find. And then, in the way that these stories always seem to go, the bones were sent away, to the Smithsonian by most accounts, or to the University of California by others, and they were never seen again. There is no Lompoc Rancho giant on display in any museum. There is no catalogue number that anyone can find. The Chumash people of the Central Coast, like the Tongva to the south, had their own stories. The Chumash spoke of an older people, the first people, who lived along the coast before the Chumash came. The first people were tall. They had double rows of teeth. They were called, in some versions of the story, the cannibals, because they had eaten human flesh, and that is why they had been destroyed by a wave or a wind or the anger of the world. The story exists in oral form across many bands of the Chumash. It is consistent enough that anthropologists who collected it in the early 20th century remarked in their published papers on how widely it was held. And so when the bones came out of the trench at Lompoc in 1933, the Chumash who knew about it did not seem surprised. They had been telling the story for a long time. The first people, the double teeth, the cannibals who were destroyed. The bones in the soil of the coast were, to them, no mystery. They were the proof of what the elders had always said, and the bones, now, are gone. The Lompoc Rancho is still a military reservation. You cannot just walk in. The trench was filled in long ago. The magazine sits on top of it. And every so often, on a quiet day at the base, someone with a longer memory than usual will mention the giant. The one in the foundations. The one that they sent away. And the wind moves through the oak trees, and the Pacific glitters in the distance. And the bones, wherever they are now, are far from the place that knew them. Number 6. The mound giants of Wisconsin and Minnesota. North of the Ohio Valley, up into the lake country, where the land flattens and the rivers move slowly and the winters are long and dark, there is another whole network of mounds. Wisconsin alone, at the time of the first European contact, contained more than 15,000 mounds. Some of them were burial mounds, like the Adena mounds to the south. Some were effigy mounds, in the shape of bears and birds and water spirits, the great lumbering shapes of which can still be seen in certain state parks from low-flying aircraft. The people who built these mounds are not as well known as the Adena. We call them simply the effigy mound builders or the late woodland peoples, and we do not know what they called themselves. What we do know is that when the mounds were opened in the 1800s and the early 1900s, the bodies found inside them often did not match the size of the local populations. In 1912, a road crew working near the small town of West Bend, Wisconsin, broke into a mound while excavating a hillside for a railway cut. Inside the mound, they reported in the Milwaukee Sentinel, they found 3 skeletons. The skeletons were laid out in a row, head to head, with their feet pointing in 3 directions. The bones were heavy. The skulls were elongated, and by the measurements taken at the site, the tallest of the 3 was 9 feet 4 inches, and the shortest was 7 feet 11. Around the bodies were copper plates, freshwater pearls, and a pipe carved in the shape of a bird with outstretched wings. The bones were photographed. The photographs were published in the Sentinel and reprinted in newspapers across the upper Midwest. And then the bones were collected by representatives of an unnamed museum in Milwaukee and removed for study. They have not been seen since. In Minnesota, in the 1880s, similar reports came out of the area around what is now the city of St. Paul. A mound on the bluff overlooking the Mississippi was opened by a farmer who wanted the land for a wheat field. Inside the mound was a stone vault. Inside the vault was a single skeleton, 8 feet 2 inches in length, with a copper crown around its head. The crown was sold to a private collector. The bones were sent to a state museum in St. Paul. Where they sit now, no one can quite say. The Ho-Chunk people of Wisconsin, who are the descendants of some of the mound-building peoples, have their own oral histories. They speak of an older people, called by various names in various stories, who were tall and powerful and who built the mounds and who eventually died out or moved away or were taken away by a sickness. In some versions of the story, the older people were the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk. In other versions, they were a separate people who lived alongside the Ho-Chunk's ancestors and then disappeared. The stories vary, but the consistent thread is that the mounds were built by someone larger than the people who came after. And when you stand today on the top of an effigy mound, in the soft green light of a Wisconsin afternoon, with the long shape of a bear or a bird stretching out beneath your feet, you can feel something of the size of the work that was done. The mounds were not casual. They were enormous. The people who built them, whoever they were, had time and labor and patience that we no longer easily imagine. And what they buried in the heart of their work, the great central figures whose graves the mounds were built to enclose, were larger than the ordinary dead. That much, at least, is in the record. The bones may be gone. The reports remain. Number 7. The Patagonian giants and the southern tip of the world. In 1520, Ferdinand Magellan, on his long voyage around the southern continent, anchored his ships in a bay along the coast of what is now Argentina. The bay was a stopping point, a place to refit the rigging, to take on fresh water, to wait out the southern winter before attempting the strait that would later bear Magellan's name. The expedition camped on the shore for nearly 5 months. They built rough huts, they hunted seals, they watched the southern sky, which is full of stars that the men from the northern hemisphere had never seen. And one afternoon, as the chronicler Antonio Pigafetta would later write in his journal, a man came out of the brush along the beach. The man was alone. He was singing. He was dancing on the sand, throwing it over his head with his hands. In the manner, Pigafetta wrote, of one who was happy. And the man was very tall. Pigafetta wrote that the tallest of the Europeans only reached, when standing beside him, to the height of his waist. The Europeans put out food. They gestured for the man to come closer. He approached, slowly, still singing. When he was close enough to see clearly, the Europeans were astonished. He was a giant. He wore the skin of an animal that the Europeans had never seen, a kind of llama, the guanaco, with the head and the legs still attached. His feet, wrapped in skins, were so large that the Spanish, in their journals, gave the place a name. They called it the country of the big feet, Patagon, in their broken Latin and Portuguese and Spanish, the land of the big feet, Patagonia. The name has stayed on the maps for 500 years. Other men of the same people came out of the brush in the days that followed. They were friendly. They ate with the Spaniards. They sang. And Magellan, in the way of conquerors of that century, decided to bring 2 of them back to Europe. He tricked them. He gave them iron chains and called the chains gifts. He told them to put their wrists through the chains to admire them, and when they did, the Spaniards locked the chains. The 2 giants were taken aboard the ships. They sailed for the strait. They did not survive the voyage. They died slowly on the long passage, of cold or of sickness or of grief. Neither one ever saw Europe. But Pigafetta's journal, when it was finally published, made the Patagonian giants famous. For the next 200 years, Every European expedition to the southern tip of the continent looked for them. Some expeditions reported finding them. Others reported finding only ordinary Tehuelche people, who were tall by European standards, but not the towering figures Pigafetta had described. By the 1700s, the giants seemed to have largely disappeared from the accounts. The Tehuelche themselves were a tall people, men averaging 6 feet or more in a century, when Europeans averaged 5.5. But they were not the 8 or 9-foot figures of the earliest journals. What happened? European disease moved through the indigenous populations of the Americas in waves, killing in some places 90% of the people in a single generation. The largest individuals, perhaps the most genetically distinct, may have been the first to fall. By the time more careful naturalists came in the 1700s and 1800s, the last of the very tall ones were dead, and only the merely tall remained. Or perhaps the giants of Pigafetta's journal were always an exaggeration, a sailor's tale, a way of making a long winter on a strange coast into a story worth telling when one finally got home. Perhaps. But Pigafetta was a careful man. His journal is detailed and consistent. He describes the language of the Tehuelche, the clothing, the food, the songs, in ways that have since been confirmed by other sources. He was not given to invention. He saw what he saw. And what he saw, on a beach at the bottom of the world in 1520, was a man who came up to the waist of a normal man, singing, throwing sand, happy for a moment before the chains. Number 8. The Tiwanaku Stones and the Andean Giants. High on the Altiplano of Bolivia, at an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet, where the air is so thin that even visitors who think they are healthy find themselves short of breath after a single staircase, there are the ruins of a city. The city is called Tiwanaku, and it sits not far from the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, in a wide cold plain where the wind never stops. The ruins are extensive. There are pyramids, half eaten by time. There are massive stone gateways, carved from single blocks, that stand in the open like the empty frames of paintings. There are walls of fitted stone, the joins so tight that the famous knife blade test, which fails on most ancient masonry, fails again here. You cannot get a knife between the stones, and the stones are large. Some of them weigh more than 100 tons. The largest weighs an estimated 131 tons. They have been moved, somehow, from quarries that lie miles away. Up the slope of the Altiplano, across rivers, over passes, and they have been set in place with such precision that thousands of years of earthquakes have not been able to shift them. The official archaeology dates Tiwanaku to between 300 AD and 1000 AD. The Inca, who came later, did not build it. The Inca, when they arrived in the area in the 1400s, found the city already in ruins, already old, already abandoned. They asked the local people who had built it, and the local people, the Aymara, who still live in the region today, gave them an answer. The Aymara said that the city had been built in a single night by a race of giants. The giants had come before the sun. They had built the stones during the long dark. And when the sun rose for the first time, the giants had been turned to stone themselves, frozen in the act of their work, scattered across the Altiplano. There are large stone figures at Tiwanaku, carved in a stiff, blocky style, with square shoulders and staring eyes and beards. The Aymara, when they speak about the figures, sometimes say that these are the giants, frozen at sunrise, turned to stone where they stood. The story is dismissed by most archaeologists as a myth, a way of explaining the inexplicable to children. The stones were moved by human labor, by many men, by thousands of men, working together over many years. Ropes, ramps, rollers, the same techniques that built the pyramids of Egypt. And perhaps that is the answer. Perhaps Tiwanaku is a monument to organization, not to size. But there is another current in the Andean tradition. The Spanish chroniclers of the 16th century who collected oral histories from the Inca and from the peoples the Inca had conquered, recorded a story that the Inca themselves told. The story said that, long before the rise of the Inca Empire, there had been a race of giants who lived in the coastal plain of Peru. The giants were tall, twice the height of normal men. They had come from the sea in reed boats from somewhere to the west. They had built cities along the coast. They had been wasteful and violent, and they had eaten the local people, and they had taken the local women. And the local people had prayed to the gods, and the gods had sent fire from the sky, and the fire had burned the giants in their cities, and their bones had been left in the ash. The story was recorded by the chronicler Cieza de Leon in the 1550s. It was recorded by Garcilaso de la Vega, the half-Inca, half-Spanish chronicler, around 1600. It appears in different forms in different sources, but the shape is consistent. A race of giants, a coastal city, fire from above, and the bones in the ash. In the 1920s, on the Santa Elena Peninsula in Ecuador, a Smithsonian-funded expedition, led by Marshal Saville, began excavating a site called Sumpa. The site is a coastal burial ground, and in the ground at Sumpa, Saville reported, were bones, many bones, and among them, in a clearly defined stratum, were the bones of unusually large individuals. Saville estimated heights of 7 feet, with some over 8. The bones were photographed. They were collected. They were shipped to the Smithsonian in Washington for study. They were not subsequently displayed. The Andean giants, like the giants of so many other places we have visited tonight, walked into the museum and never walked out. And the stones of Tawanaku stand on the altiplano in the cold wind, and the lake reflects the great cold sky, and the Aymara, who have not forgotten, watch the tourists climb on the stones and take photographs, and they do not always say what they know. Number 9. The long ears of Easter Island. Almost 2,000 miles into the Pacific, off the western coast of South America, there is a triangular island. It is small, 64 square miles, volcanic. Treeless now, though it was once covered in palms. And on the island, set into the soil along the slopes of the central volcano and along the perimeter of the coast, are statues. There are nearly 900 of them. They are called moai. They are carved from the soft volcanic stone of the central quarry, called Rano Raraku, and they were transported, by means we still argue about, to platforms along the shore. The statues are large. The average moai is 14 feet tall and weighs 14 tons. The largest completed moai is 33 feet tall and weighs 82 tons. The largest one ever started, which was abandoned in the quarry before completion, would have been nearly 70 feet tall and would have weighed close to 300 tons. The faces of the moai are stylized. They are not portraits. They are something else. The brows are heavy. The noses are long and straight. The lips are thin. The ears on the older moai are very long. They stretch down past the jawline, almost to the shoulder. The people of Easter Island, when the first European visitors came to the island in 1722, were divided into 2 groups. One group was called the short ears. The other group was called the long ears. The long ears stretched their earlobes deliberately in the manner of certain other Pacific peoples by inserting heavier and heavier weights as children. By adulthood, their ears, like the ears of the moai, hung down almost to their shoulders. The short ears did not. The short ears were the majority. The long ears were a smaller group, an older group, and according to the oral history of the island, the long ears were the original inhabitants. They had come first. They had built the moai. The short ears had come later, in a second wave of migration, and they had served the long ears for several generations, performing the labor of moving the stones. And then, in a date that the oral histories place in the 17th century, the short ears had risen up against the long ears in a war that ended at a place called Poik Ditch, on the eastern peninsula of the island, where the Long Ears had built a trench and filled it with brushwood, intending to set it on fire and burn the Short Ears alive when they attacked. The Short Ears found out. They surrounded the Long Ears. They drove them into their own ditch. They lit the ditch on fire. And the Long Ears were killed almost to the last one. A few survived. They intermarried with the Short Ears. But as a distinct people, the Long Ears ended at Poik Ditch. The Moai on the platforms along the shore were eventually pulled down by the Short Ears in the centuries that followed, in cycles of internal warfare that fragmented the island's society. The trees were cut down. The soil was eroded. The civilization of Easter Island collapsed into a thin and hungry remnant. And when the Europeans came, in 1722, they found a small population of perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 people, living among the ruins of something they could no longer explain. The statues, the Long Ears, said in the oral histories collected by later anthropologists, were not built by ordinary men. They were built by a people who had powers we no longer have. The statues had walked, the stories said. They had walked from the quarry to the platforms under their own power, by the will of priests who knew how to speak to them, and the Long Ears had been taller than the Short Ears, 2 heads taller in some versions of the story. They had been the descendants of the first people, who had come from a land in the west, a land called Hiva, which sank into the sea. They had carried with them the knowledge of how to make the stones move, and when the Long Ears died, the knowledge died with them, and the stones on the slopes of the quarry were left where they lay, half carved, half emerged from the rock, like figures trying to climb out of a dream. Some of them are still there. You can walk up the slope of Runoraraku and see them, faces in the stone, long bodies, half exposed, half buried, waiting, or just gone. Number 10. The Waitaha and the older people of New Zealand. The official history of New Zealand says that the islands were uninhabited until roughly the 1200s AD, when the ancestors of the present-day Maori arrived in great voyaging canoes from the central Pacific. Before that arrival, the official history says, the islands were empty, no people, only birds, only the great flightless moa, walking through the forests, eating the leaves of the cabbage trees. The Maori arrived. They hunted the moa to extinction. They cleared the land. They built their pa, their fortified villages, along the ridges and the headlands. And that, the official story says, is how the human history of New Zealand begins. But there is another version. The other version is held by a people called the Waitaha. The Waitaha say that they are older than the Maori. They say that their ancestors came to the islands many generations before the great voyaging canoes. They say that the first people of the islands were a fair-skinned, light-haired people, taller than the Maori who came later, who lived along the coasts and in the great forests of the South Island. They built no great structures. They left few signs of their presence. They lived gently, fished from canoes, gathered berries, raised small gardens. And when the Maori arrived, the Waitaha did not fight them. They intermarried in some cases. They moved into the deep forests in others. And the larger Waitaha people, the original founders, were absorbed or displaced or simply died out. The Waitaha oral tradition, kept alive in fragments by a small number of elders into the present day, speaks of the founding ancestors as tall, very tall, with red or blonde hair and skin lighter than the skin of any Polynesian. The traditions say they came from a land called Hawaii, which is the same name used by the Maori for their ancestral homeland, but the Waitaha Hawaii is described differently. It was a land in the far west, beyond the sunset. It sank under the sea. And the survivors made their way, in long voyages, to the empty green islands at the bottom of the world. There they lived for many centuries, before the second wave of arrivals, the Maori proper, came in the canoes that history records. Most academic historians dismiss the Waitaha tradition. They say it is a romantic invention, perhaps influenced by European ideas about lost continents and ancient races. They say it has no archaeological support, and yet, in certain places in New Zealand, in caves and rock shelters in the deep forests of both islands, there are remains that do not fit the standard story. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, settlers and explorers reported finding, in a number of caves, very large skeletons. The skeletons were associated with primitive tools, stone implements, and shells. They were not Maori burials. They were older, they were larger, they were photographed, in a few cases, by people with cameras. And then, in the manner that has become familiar to us tonight, they were sent away. To universities, to Wellington, to Auckland, sometimes to England, and they did not come back. The Waitaha elders, when they speak of these finds, say simply that the bones are the bones of the founding ancestors, the first people, the tall ones. They were here before the Maori. They were here before the Moa hunters. They lived gently. They did not fight. And when the second wave came, they faded into the forests and into the marriages, and the line continued, in small streams, down to the present day. There are Waitaha people alive today who claim direct descent from this older line. They are quiet about it, mostly. They have learned that the official world does not want to hear it. But on certain nights, in certain places in the South Island, in front of a fire in a backyard, with the wind coming off the southern ocean and the sky full of southern stars, an elder will speak. And what the elder will say is this: we were here first. We were taller. We were a different people. And we are still here, in the blood, in the memory, in the names of certain places that the maps no longer record. And the forests of the South Island are very dark and very deep, and the canopies close over the trails of any walker who steps off the marked paths, and what lies under the moss, in caves that no one has yet found, is the kind of thing that does not insist on being known. Number 11. The Gympie Pyramid and the Giants of Queensland. On the eastern coast of Australia, in the state of Queensland, about 100 miles north of Brisbane, there is a small farming town called Gympie. Gympie was, for a time, a gold rush town. In the 1860s, the discovery of gold in the creeks around the area brought tens of thousands of miners, and the town grew quickly into a small city. After the gold was gone, the town shrank back to a quiet agricultural community, producing dairy and pineapples and tropical fruit. And on a hillside just outside the town, on a piece of farmland that has changed hands many times over the years, there is, or there was, a strange structure, a terraced hill, stones laid in courses, a shape that, depending on the witness and the year of the witness, has been described as a pyramid, a step pyramid, a temple, or simply a pile of rocks built by an early Italian settler to drain his vineyard. The official explanation for the Gympie Pyramid is that it is a settler structure. It was built by a man named A.J. Carrara, an Italian immigrant, in the 1870s, to support grapevines on a steep slope. The stones were stacked into terraces. The vines were planted on the terraces. The vines failed. The structure was abandoned. The vegetation grew over it, and what remained, by the 20th century, was a strange terraced hill that looked, to those who did not know its origin, like something much older. That is the official story. But there is another story. The other story comes from a number of older residents of the area, and from a Dr. Rex Gilroy, an amateur Australian researcher who spent decades collecting reports of unusual artifacts and remains from the Australian bush. Gilroy claimed that the Gympie Pyramid was much older than the 1870s. He claimed that, at the base of the structure and in the surrounding fields, artifacts had been found over the years that did not fit the European settler story. He claimed that small statues, carved in a style resembling the artifacts of South America, had been turned up by farmers' ploughs. He claimed that bronze implements of types unknown in Australian Aboriginal cultures had been found in the area, and he claimed that in caves in the surrounding ranges there were stories of giant skeletons told by the local Aboriginal people and by certain older settlers who remembered finds from the early days of the gold rush. Gilroy was not a careful researcher. His claims have not been independently verified. The artifacts he photographed have, in most cases, been dismissed as misidentified natural objects or as later carvings of doubtful provenance. The pyramid itself, the most accessible piece of physical evidence, was destroyed in the 1970s when the farm changed hands and the new owner used a bulldozer to flatten the structure for pasture. There is nothing left on the site now but a low rise and a few scattered stones. But the Aboriginal traditions of the wider region, the traditions of the Kabi Kabi people and others, include stories of older beings, the giants of the dream time, who walked the land before the people we know. The giants were called by various names in various languages. They had built certain stone arrangements. They had moved certain mountains. They had been driven away, or had withdrawn, or had been turned into the rocks themselves. The traditions are old. They are not invented for tourist consumption. They were collected by anthropologists in the 1800s and the 1900s, before the modern interest in alternative history had any commercial value. And the giants in those stories were not metaphors. They were beings, specific beings, with specific names who had lived in specific places and whose mark could still be read in the landscape by those who knew how to read it. The Gympie Pyramid is gone. The artifacts, if they ever existed in the form Gilroy described, are scattered into private collections or lost altogether. But the Aboriginal stories persist. The land remembers what the official records have forgotten. And along the spine of the eastern ranges of Australia, in caves that are still mostly unexplored, in valleys that have not been surveyed, in places where the modern world has not yet had a reason to look closely, the rumours of large beings continue to drift, in the wind, on the breath of older men who learned the stories from their grandfathers, who learned them from their grandfathers, in the long, unbroken chain that connects the living country to whatever it once held. Number 12. The temples of Malta and the giantess Sansuna. In the middle of the Mediterranean, almost equidistant from Sicily, Tunisia, and Libya, there is a small group of limestone islands. The largest is called Malta. The second is called Gozo. On both of these islands, scattered across the cliffs and the rolling stone fields, there are temples. The temples are old. They are very old. Some of them have been dated to 3600 BC, which makes them older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, older than almost any other surviving stone structure in the world. They are megalithic, which means they are built of massive blocks. Some of the blocks weigh more than 50 tons. They have been shaped, dressed, and fitted together with a precision that, considering the dates, should not be possible. There are no metal tools in the Malta of 3600 BC. There were not supposed to be wheels. There were not supposed to be draft animals capable of moving stones of that size. And yet the stones were moved. The temples were built. And inside them, in chambers that opened off the central courts, archaeologists have found altars, an offering bowls, and small figurines of remarkable craftsmanship. And the figurines, almost without exception, depict a single subject, a figure, sometimes seated, sometimes standing, sometimes lying down. The figure is enormously fat. The thighs are massive, the hips are wide, the breasts hang down to the lap, the arms are folded over the belly. The face, when it is shown, is calm, almost smiling. The figures are usually small, the size of a hand, though one statue at the Temple of Tarsian was originally over 2 meters tall, and only the base now remains. The people of Malta today, the modern Maltese, who have lived on the islands for many generations, have a name for the figure. They call her the Fat Lady, and in the oral traditions of the older Maltese countryside, the Fat Lady is associated with a name, Sansuna, the giantess Sansuna. The legend says that the temples were built by Sansuna, a single woman of enormous size who lived alone on the islands in a time before any other people had come. She built the temples with her own hands. She lifted the great stones into place by her own strength. She carved the figures of herself as offerings to gods we no longer remember. And then, when her work was done, she lay down in one of the temples and went to sleep. And she did not wake up, and the stones of her own body, over thousands of years, became the rock of the islands themselves. There are large handprints, said by some, in certain stones at certain temples, that the locals point to as the prints of Sansuna's hands. There are passages in the temples, archways and doorways, that are sized strangely, too tall for an ordinary person to pass through without ducking, too narrow for a normal shoulder to fit, as if they had been built for a body of a different shape than ours. The temples of Malta were eventually abandoned. Around 2500 BC, by the dating of the archaeologists, the people who built them simply stopped. The temples were sealed, the fires went out, the offerings ceased, and whatever happened on the islands in the centuries that followed left almost no record. By the time the Phoenicians arrived, 1500 years later, the temples were already silent ruins, the original builders long gone. Who built the temples? The official answer is that they were built by an organized society of farmers, herders, and craftsmen who used clever leverage and many hands to move the stones. Their bones have been found in the catacombs beneath the temples. They were normal-sized people, with the diet and the dental wear of an ordinary farming culture. And yet the figurines, the central religious image of these people, depict a body that is not their body. A body of enormous size. A body that they remembered, perhaps, or worshipped from a time before. And the Maltese country people, who have lived on the islands for 2,000 years, who carry in their language fragments of Phoenician and Latin and Arabic and Sicilian and the older languages beneath those, still call her Sansuna, the giantess, the one who built the temples, the one who fell asleep in the stone and never woke up and is still there, beneath the limestone, somewhere, dreaming. Number 13. The Fomorians, the Giant's Causeway, and the deep memory of Ireland. The northern coast of Ireland, in the county of Antrim, is a place of black basalt cliffs that fall sheer into the cold Atlantic. The water there is dark green close to the rocks and goes black further out. The wind blows almost constantly. The sky is rarely entirely free of cloud, and along a stretch of coast about 2 miles long, near the small village of Bushmills, there is a strange formation. The ground is paved with hexagons, thousands of them, pillars of black basalt, rising in close-packed columns, their tops cut flat or rounded into low domes, walking out into the sea like the stones of a vast paved road. The pillars are nearly perfect in their geometry. 6 sides, equal angles. They fit together so closely that water gathers in the seams, as in the mortar of a man-laid pavement. The geological explanation is that the formation was made by the slow cooling of a lava flow about 60 million years ago. The lava cracked as it cooled, in the way that all such lava flows crack, into roughly hexagonal columns. There are similar formations in Iceland and in California, and in other places where ancient volcanic activity has been exposed by erosion. It is, the geologists say, a natural phenomenon, common enough. Just unusually beautiful here. But the people of Ireland have always called it something else. They have called it the Giant's Causeway. And the legend is this: in the long ago time, before the saints, before the kings, when Ireland was still in the shape of its own ancient self, there lived in the north a giant called Finn MacCool. Finn was not the largest of the giants, but he was strong and quick-witted, and he was the chief defender of the green country against the threats that came from across the sea. The greatest of those threats was a giant from Scotland called Benandonna, who lived on the island of Staffa, where there is a similar basalt formation that the locals there call Fingal's Cave. Benandone was much larger than Finn. He had been calling across the channel for years, taunting Finn, daring him to fight. And Finn, who was tired of the taunts, decided to settle the matter. He built a causeway across the sea. He carried stones from the cliffs of Antrim, and he placed them in the water, one by one, in long lines, walking out from the shore. The causeway grew. It stretched towards Scotland. And when it was nearly complete, Finn saw, in the distance, Benandonna walking across it to meet him. And Benandonna, even from that distance, was visibly much larger than Finn had remembered. The giant of Scotland was enormous. Finn realized he could not win the fight, so he ran home. He told his wife, Una, that the largest giant in the world was coming to fight him. Una thought for a moment, and then she dressed Finn as a baby, in swaddling clothes, and laid him in an enormous cradle she built from a fallen tree. When Benandone arrived and demanded to see Finn, Una said that Finn was out hunting, but that he would be back soon, and that Benandonna could meet the baby in the meantime. Benandonna looked into the cradle. He saw the size of the baby, and he thought, if the baby is this size, the father must be a monster. And he turned and ran back across the causeway toward Scotland, tearing up the stones as he went, so that Finn could not follow. The result was the broken causeway we see today. Hexagons on the Antrim coast, hexagons in Fingal's Cave in Scotland. The two ends of a road that once joined them, torn apart by the panic of a giant who did not want to fight. That is the story. It is told in schoolrooms in Ireland. It is told to tourists at the visitor centre. It is a beautiful story, full of the humour and the cunning that runs through the older Irish tales. But behind it, in the deeper layers of the Irish tradition, there is a darker story. The Irish, in the medieval period, compiled their own origin myth in a great book called the Lebor Gabala Eren, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. The book describes a series of waves of inhabitants. Each wave came from somewhere else. Each wave fought the inhabitants who were already there. And in the long sequence of waves, one group appears again and again, the Fomorians. The Fomorians were not Irish. They were the first inhabitants of the island, the people who had been there before the Irish came. They were described in the medieval texts as giants. Some of them had one eye, one arm, one leg. Some of them were monstrous in shape. Their king, Bela of the Evil Eye, had a single great eye in the middle of his forehead, which could kill any man it looked upon. The Fomorians lived in dark places. They came out at night. They demanded tribute from the Irish who arrived later. They were eventually defeated in a great battle at a place called Mag Tuired by the Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who were themselves displaced later by the Milesians, the ancestors of the historical Irish. The Fomorians, after their defeat, were said to have retreated under the sea, or under the hills, or into the other world, the realm of the dead, where the older inhabitants of Ireland still live and still occasionally interfere in the affairs of the living. The Fomorians were giants. They were the first. They are the substratum of the Irish memory. And the bones of giants in Ireland have been reported in many places over the centuries. In the 17th century, in County Antrim, a tenant farmer was said to have unearthed, in a peat bog, the body of a giant, 12 feet tall, with red hair, dressed in primitive clothing, preserved by the acid of the bog. The body was photographed in a famous engraving that circulated in the British press in the 1890s, an engraving that is now considered by most historians to be a hoax, but which was for many decades taken seriously, and which generations of Irish country people pointed to as proof of what their grandfathers had told them. There were giants in the bogs. There were giants under the hills. There were giants whose causeways still stretched out into the sea. The bogs of Ireland are deep. They are dark. They preserve in their acid waters the bodies of those who fall into them, sometimes for thousands of years. The famous bog bodies of Ireland and Denmark, the Tolland man and the old Krogan man and the others, were small dark people, preserved like leather, their last meals still in their stomachs. They were not giants, they were ordinary, but the bogs are large. They are mostly unexplored. They contain, in their lower layers, materials that have not been seen by any living eye. Whether what is there includes the bones of the Fomorians, the older people who walked the green country before the first Gaelic foot was set on it, no one can say for certain. The bogs do not give up their secrets quickly, and the wind on the Giant's Causeway never stops, and the hexagons run out into the dark green sea, and somewhere out there, under the water, the road continues. Number 14. The Caucasus and the High Passes. Between the Black Sea and the Caspian, in the long arc of mountains that divides Europe from Asia, there is a region that has, since the most ancient times, been considered a place where the older world has lingered. The Caucasus is a region of dozens of small languages, some of them spoken by only a few thousand people, some of them not related to any other language family on Earth. The valleys are deep, the villages cling to the slopes. The traditions are old, and in certain places in the Caucasus, particularly in the country of Georgia, in the region around the spa town of Borhomi, in the high valleys above the town, there have been, over the past century, reports of unusual bones. In 1984, in a cave near the village of Udabno, in eastern Georgia, a Soviet expedition reported the discovery of skeletal remains of unusual size. The expedition was small. The reports were quiet. The bones, according to the published account, were of individuals roughly 2.5 meters in height. That is over 8 feet. The bones were collected and transported to a research institute in Tbilisi for analysis. The fall of the Soviet Union, a few years later, scattered the materials of many such expeditions. The Borjomi bones, as they came to be called, are not currently on public display. Their location is uncertain. Some sources say they are still in storage in Tbilisi. Other sources say they were transferred to Russia. Still others say they were lost in the chaos of the early 1990s, when many state collections were broken up or sold off. In the same period, in the 1990s, in the mountainous region of Adygea, in the southwestern Russian Caucasus, a researcher named Vladimir Sorokin reported finding, in a small cave above a high alpine meadow, a single skeleton. The skeleton was described as being 3 meters tall, almost 10 feet. Sorokin's report was published in a small regional journal. It did not attract international attention. The bones, according to Sorokin, were collected by local authorities and removed to a regional museum. Sorokin himself died in unclear circumstances in 2004. His original photographs of the find have not been located. The skeleton itself has not been re-examined by any subsequent researcher. The local people of the Caucasus, however, have their own long tradition of giants. In the Nart sagas, the great body of mythological literature, shared by the Circassian, Ossetian, Chechen, and other Caucasian peoples, there are stories of an older race of giants who lived in the mountains before the ordinary people came. The giants were called by different names in different traditions. In the Ossetian tradition, they were called the Wayug. They were enormously strong. They had iron limbs in some versions. They could throw mountains. They were eventually defeated by the trickery of the Nart heroes, who were ordinary-sized men with extraordinary cleverness and who outwitted the giants in a series of contests and combats that the elders of the Caucasus still tell. The giants were not killed all at once. They withdrew, gradually, into the higher and more remote valleys. They became hermits, in some versions, living alone in caves, eating wild goats and the bones of their own dead. They diminished generation by generation, as the food in the high places ran out and the women became scarce. And eventually, they died out, and only the stories remained. The stories of the Nart sagas are very old. They are pre-Christian. They contain elements that are clearly older than the Indo-European migrations into the region. Some researchers have suggested that they preserve a memory of the actual encounter between the modern human inhabitants of the Caucasus and an older population, perhaps an archaic human, perhaps a relict population of the Neanderthals, who survived in the high valleys long after they were extinct elsewhere in Europe. Neanderthals were not, on average, much taller than modern humans, but they were heavier, more robust, with thicker bones and more powerful muscles. A Neanderthal man and a modern man, standing side by side, would have looked, to a casual observer, like a small giant and an ordinary person. The Neanderthals were thought to have died out about 40,000 years ago. But in the deep valleys of the Caucasus, where the modern world has never quite reached, where small villages still speak languages no one else speaks, the possibility of a longer survival cannot be ruled out absolutely. Whether the Wayug of the Nart sagas were Neanderthals, or some other archaic relative, or simply a memory of the very tall men who occasionally appear in any population, no one can say. The skeletons in the Tbilisi Institute, if they still exist, might tell us. The skeleton in the cave above the alpine meadow, if it could be relocated, might tell us. But the materials are scattered, the researchers are dead, and the high passes of the Caucasus go on being high, and the small villages go on being small, and the snow comes in the winter and seals the upper valleys for months at a time. And what walks there, in the long Russian winter, in the places where no roads go, has not been seen by any modern eye. Number 15. The Aleutian Islands and the place where the giants went to lie down. The long chain of the Aleutian Islands stretches westward from the mainland of Alaska for more than 1,000 miles in a slow curve across the northern Pacific toward the coast of Russia. There are nearly 300 islands in the chain. Most of them are uninhabited. The climate is cold, wet, and storm-racked. The treeless slopes rise from the cold sea in green shoulders that disappear into low clouds. There are volcanoes along the chain. There are bays where whales rest. There are kelp forests in the shallows that grow as tall as terrestrial trees. And on a number of the islands, in caves above the high tide line, in places that have been examined only briefly and never thoroughly, there are mummies. The mummies of the Aleutian Islands were known to the first European visitors. Russian fur traders, in the 1700s, reported visiting caves on certain islands in which the dead of the local Aleut people had been preserved by the cold and the dry sea wind in remarkable condition. The bodies were wrapped in sea otter furs and dried bird skins. They were placed in seated positions, their knees drawn up to their chests. They were stored on shelves of natural stone, in caves whose entrances faced away from the prevailing wind. And among the mummies, the Russians reported, were some that were of unusual size. The Aleut people themselves, in their oral traditions, distinguished between several kinds of dead. The ordinary dead were buried in shallow graves near the village. The respected dead were placed in the lower caves, and the older dead, the dead of the very ancient ones, were placed in the higher caves, in the deeper recesses, where only certain shamans were permitted to go. The older dead, according to the traditions, were of a different people. They had come first. They were taller. They had lived on the islands before the Aleut, and they had taught the Aleut how to hunt the sea otter and how to read the weather. And then they had withdrawn into the caves and lain down, and they had not died exactly, but had passed into a kind of long sleep, from which they might, in some future time, return. The European explorers who looted these caves in the 17 and 1800s removed many of the mummies. They sold them to museums in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in Copenhagen, in London, in New York. Some of the mummies were displayed publicly. Others went into research collections. Many were destroyed during the bombings of the Second World War, in the museums of Europe and the Soviet Union, and of those that survived, a number have been quietly repatriated to the Aleut people, who have reburied them in their original places, in caves that the public is not permitted to enter. Among the materials that were recorded before they were lost or returned were measurements, and the measurements in a number of the older mummies were unusual. There were Aleut mummies that were over 7 feet tall. There were a few that approached 8 feet. The Aleut people of the modern era are not a particularly tall people. They average about 5 feet 6. The mummies, the 7 and 8 foot mummies in particular, came from the older strata, the deeper caves, the places associated in the oral tradition with the first people. They were preserved well enough that hair, in some cases, was still attached to the scalp. The hair, in those cases, was often red or reddish-brown, sometimes light brown, in a few cases almost white, not the black hair of the modern Aleut, a different hair. The Aleut elders, when asked about these older mummies, used to say that the bodies were the bodies of the ancestors who had come from the west, from across the sea, from a great country that had sunk under the water in a time of long ago. The ancestors had landed on the islands, they had taught the Aleut, and they had lain down in the caves, in their otter furs and their birdskin clothing, and they had become the bones of the islands themselves. The caves are still there, some of them. Many of them have been emptied by the looting of the past 3 centuries. Some of them, in the more remote islands, in the corners of the chain that are rarely visited, may still hold their original contents. The wind on the Aleutians is constant. It comes from the north. It comes from the south. It comes from every direction in turn, in the long storms that move across the Bering Sea and the North Pacific, and in the caves where the wind cannot reach. The cold keeps things the way they were. The mummies sit in the dark. The eyes have collapsed. The skin has darkened. But the shape of the body is still there. The shape of a tall person, knees drawn up, hands folded, waiting. And when you read the oral histories carefully, you find that the Aleut elders did not say the giants died. They said the giants went to lie down, to sleep, to wait. And that is where, for the purposes of our journey tonight, the list of 15 places ends. The caves of the Aleutians, the long sleep of the first people, the chain of green islands curving away into the cold sea toward a place that is not on any modern map. Now we have walked through 15 places. The cave in Nevada, with its red hair and its sealed tomb story. The mounds of the Ohio Valley, with their central burials and their 7-foot kings. The island off the California coast, with its 800 graves and its rows of long bones. The salt flats of Death Valley, with their underground city and their vanished prospector. The trench at Lompoc, where the 12-foot skeleton came up out of the soil for an afternoon and then was sent away forever. The mound fields of Wisconsin and Minnesota, with their effigies of bears and their 9-foot dead. The beach in Patagonia, where Magellan's men measured themselves against a man who came up only to their waists. The stones of Tiwanaku, set in place, the local people say, by giants who turned to stone at sunrise. The slopes of Easter Island, with the long ears of the moai and the burned ditch at Poika. The forests of New Zealand, where the Waitaha remember the founding ancestors, who were tall and light and went into the deep bush. The hillside outside Gympie, where a pyramid stood until the bulldozers came in the 1970s. The limestone temples of Malta, with the sleeping giantess Sansuna in the rock. The hexagons of the Giant's Causeway, running out into the cold green sea toward Scotland and the broken end of the road. The high passes of the Caucasus, where the Wayug of the Naht sagas withdrew into the higher valleys and slowly died. And the caves of the Aleutian Islands, where the tall first people, the elders say, did not die at all, but only lay down to sleep. 15 places, 15 stories. And as we stand back from the list, In the quiet of the night, in this slow hour before sleep, a shape begins to emerge. The stories are not all the same. The bones in Nevada are different from the bones in Wisconsin. The legends of Sansuna do not match the legends of the Fomorians. The fates are different. Some giants are burned, some drown, some lie down, some are absorbed into the marriages of later peoples, some simply disappear into the bush. But underneath the variation, in the way that a river underneath ice will keep flowing in the same direction, even when the surface is locked, there is a single pattern. There were once people taller than us. They lived in many places. They are no longer here. And the bones of them, when they have been found, have and, with strange and consistent regularity, been sent away to institutions and not returned. The institution that gets named most often, in the United States at least, is the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846, with money left in the will of an English chemist named James Smithson, who had never visited the United States and who left his fortune to the American government for the purpose of, as his will said, the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. The Smithsonian grew, over the second half of the 19th century, into the leading scientific institution of the United States. It sponsored expeditions, it collected materials, it built museums on the Mall in Washington, and one of its primary areas of activity, particularly in the 1870s and 1880s, was the excavation and study of the mound cultures of the American interior. The Smithsonian sent teams into Ohio, into West Virginia, into Wisconsin, into Tennessee, into every state where the great earthworks rose out of the floodplains and the forested ridges. The teams excavated, they measured, they photographed, they wrote reports, and they collected materials, hundreds of thousands of items, pottery, stone tools, copper plates, pieces of mica, pieces of bone, and among the bones, by the records that have survived in the Smithsonian's own reports of the period, were many that were unusually large. The reports describe skeletons of 7 feet, 8 feet, occasionally 9 feet, recovered from central vaults in dozens of mounds across the eastern half of the continent. The reports are not whispered. They were published. They were in the annual reports of the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology for the 1870s and 1880s. They were read by anyone who cared to read them. And then, in the early 20th century, the references began to disappear. The later reports stopped mentioning the unusual heights. The skeletons stopped appearing in the publications. The catalogue numbers, where they had been assigned, became increasingly difficult to track. And by the middle of the 20th century, the Smithsonian's official position was that no such skeletons existed in their collection. That the older reports had been exaggerations, or misreadings, or mistakes. That the bones had been those of ordinary-sized individuals, measured carelessly by men who did not know how to handle remains. There are several explanations for this shift. One is the explanation of the official Smithsonian itself. The older reports were unreliable. The measurements were taken in haste, often by amateur excavators, in conditions that did not permit careful work. The bones often crumbled on contact with air, and the measurements taken in the field could not be verified later. As anthropology professionalized in the 20th century, the field discarded the older claims as the products of an unscientific era. That is the official explanation. The other explanation, the one favored by the alternative researchers, is that the Smithsonian, at some point in the late 19th or early 20th century, made a decision. The decision was that the public was not ready to know what the bones implied, that a parallel race of giants in the heart of North America contradicted the standard story of human origins, the standard story of the indigenous Americans as the first inhabitants of the continent, the standard story of a single line of evolution from Africa outward. The Smithsonian, in this view, made a decision to suppress, to bury the bones in the storage vaults of the institution, to rewrite the catalogues, to deny, when asked, that the materials had ever existed, and to wait for the older reports to fade from memory, as the men who had written them died and the newspapers in which they had been published yellowed in their files. Whether the suppression was deliberate or merely the natural result of changing professional standards, the result is the same. The bones, if they are anywhere, are not in public view. The Smithsonian's storage facilities in suburban Maryland are vast. They contain millions of objects. They are not open to casual research. And inside them, in places no journalist has been allowed to walk, the older collections sit in their wooden crates, in their cardboard boxes, with the labels of the 1880s still attached. And whether the labels say what they used to say, no one outside the institution can confirm. The Smithsonian story is one piece of a larger pattern. Other institutions, in other countries, have similar stories. The Tbilisi Institute in Georgia, the Auckland Museum in New Zealand, the British Museum, where certain materials from Ireland and from the Aleutians are said to be in storage but are not on display. The Bolivian National Museum in La Paz, which holds materials from Tiwanaku that have never been thoroughly examined by foreign researchers. The pattern is not American, it is global. The bones, wherever they are found, are collected. The materials are sent to a central institution. And then, after a brief period of publicity, they disappear from public view. They are not destroyed. They are too valuable for that. They are catalogued. They are stored. They sit in the dark. And they wait. Waiting perhaps for a future generation to ask the right questions. Or waiting perhaps for the questions themselves to be forgotten, so that the storage rooms can be quietly cleared and the bones can be quietly disposed of and the matter can be closed. Now we turn to the question of how. How did the giants vanish? The 15 places we visited tonight all tell, in their different ways, the same story. There were once tall people. They are no longer here. But the stories differ on the cause. And the cause, when you set the stories side by side, falls into 3 large patterns. The first pattern is disease. The second is water. The third is war. Let us take them in turn. The pattern of disease. In many of the stories we have heard tonight, the giants do not die in a single event. They diminish gradually, over generations. The bones in the Adena mounds are of 7 and 8 foot people. The bones of the historical Ho-Chunk and other Wisconsin peoples, who came after the mound builders, are of normal-sized people. Something happened in between. Something cut the tall lineages out of the population. Disease is a candidate. Disease, in the history of the Americas, has been the great erasing force. When the first Europeans arrived, in 1500 and afterward, they carried diseases that had been incubating in the dense populations of the Old World for thousands of years. Smallpox, measles, influenza. The Americas had no exposure to these diseases. The indigenous populations had no resistance. And in waves that moved across the continents faster than the Europeans themselves moved, sometimes years ahead of any white face being seen, the diseases killed. By some estimates, 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the first century after contact. Whole nations vanished. Whole languages went silent. Whole burial mounds were left unguarded. The people, who would have known their meanings, dead in their winter villages. In a population that had once contained a strain of tall genetics, the strain could have been the first to fall. Tall people, with greater body mass, have greater energy requirements. They eat more. They tire faster when food is short. They have more body surface across which fever can drain heat. In any population reduced by famine and disease, the largest individuals tend to die first. If the disease was sustained, generation after generation, the tall genetics could have been winnowed out almost entirely within a few centuries. The remaining population would have been shorter, lighter, hardier. The medium-sized people we see today. That is the disease explanation. It works in some places. It works for the Americas, where disease was the dominant historical reality of the contact period. It may work also for Patagonia, where the very tall figures of Pigafetta's journal were not seen again by the careful naturalists of the 1700s and 1800s. They had died in the first wave. They had not been replaced. The medium-sized Tehuelche, who survived, were tall by European standards, but not Patagonian by the original measure. But disease does not work as an explanation everywhere. It does not work in Malta, where the giants disappeared more than 2,000 years before any European disease made it to the islands. It does not work in Tiwanaku, where the giants are said to have lived and died long before the first contact era. It does not work in Easter Island, where the long ears were destroyed by the short ears in a war, not by any pestilence. Disease is part of the picture. It is not the whole picture. For the rest, we have to turn to other patterns. The pattern of water. This is the pattern that, in the older traditions of the world, is the most universal. There was a flood. There was a great flood. There was a wave that came in from the sea, or a rain that fell for many days, or a melting of mountains, or a sinking of land. And the older world, with its larger people, was drowned. The flood appears in the traditions of nearly every culture on earth. The Sumerian flood, the Hebrew flood, the Greek flood of Deucalion, the Hindu flood of Manu, the Chinese flood of Yu, the Aztec flood, the Maya flood, the flood in the stories of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Hopi, the Inuit, the flood in the stories of the Aboriginal Australians, the Maori, the Hawaiians, the Tongans, the Samoans, the flood in the European traditions of Atlantis, the flood in the older traditions of the Aleut, who said their ancestors came from a country that sank into the sea. The flood is everywhere. The official position is that these traditions, although strikingly similar in their broad shape, are independent local memories of separate local flooding events. The rivers of Mesopotamia flooded. The Pacific coast of the Americas flooded during tsunamis. The lowlands of Southeast Asia flooded during the rising of the sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Each culture preserved its own flood. The similarities are coincidence. The official position is plausible. There were many local floods. The end of the ice age, between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, raised the sea level by more than 300 feet. Coastlines around the world were drowned. Lands that had been habitable for tens of thousands of years went underwater in a few generations. The Black Sea, which had been a freshwater lake, was breached by the rising Mediterranean in a catastrophic flood. That the most recent research dates to about 7,400 BC. Entire civilizations may have been built on coastal plains that are now 30 meters under the sea. The English Channel, the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, the Sunda Shelf in Indonesia. All of these were dry land within the time of behaviorally modern humans. All of these went under as the ice melted. The drowning was real. It was widespread. It was the largest geographical change in the recent history of the planet. And if there were tall people living in lowland places around the world, the drowning would have hit them disproportionately hard. Tall people, with the larger settlements that often accompany them, tend to build along the coasts, along the rivers, on the rich alluvial flats that are the first places to go under when water rises. Their cities would have drowned, their fields would have been salted, their populations would have collapsed, while shorter, more dispersed peoples, who lived in the highlands and the marginal lands, would have survived. The mud flood theory of alternative history takes this further. The mud flood theory holds that the catastrophe was not just a slow rise in sea level over many centuries, but a rapid wave or series of waves that swept over the surface of the continents, covering the older buildings and the older bones in a layer of mud and silt that hardened into the soil we walk on today. The theory is dismissed by most geologists. There is no clear stratigraphic evidence of such an event in the recent past. But the theory has an emotional power that is hard to argue against entirely. The idea that, just below the surface of every modern city, there is the buried foundation of an older one, populated by people who were taller and who built better. The idea that the past is not behind us but underneath us, and that, if we could dig down only a little way, we would find the older world. It is a powerful idea. It explains, in a single stroke, why the giants are no longer here, and why the older stories are so consistent. They drowned. They were buried. The mud closed over them, and we walk over their graves every day, without knowing. The pattern of war. The third pattern is war, the pattern of being killed deliberately in violent conflict by the people who came after. This pattern appears most clearly in some of the stories we visited tonight. The Siteka of Nevada were driven into a cave and burned alive by the Paiute, in the oral tradition of the region. The Long Ears of Easter Island were driven into a ditch and burned alive by the Short Ears, in the oral tradition of the island. The Fomorians of Ireland were defeated at the Battle of Magtuird by the Tuatha De Danann, in the medieval Irish chronicles. The Wayug of the Caucasus were outwitted and killed by the Nart heroes, in the oral epics of the Caucasian peoples. The giants of the Peruvian coast were burned by fire from the sky, in the chronicles of the Inca, which may have been a memory of an actual volcanic event, or which may have been a memory of a war so violent it was remembered as an act of the gods. In nearly every tradition, there is a moment of conflict, a moment when the older, taller people are confronted by the newer, shorter people. And the shorter people, by craft or by numbers or by alliance with forces the giants did not understand, prevail. The giants are killed, the giants are burned, the giants are driven into the caves. The giants are sealed up. The giants are remembered, afterward, with a mixture of fear and admiration, in the way that conquerors always remember those they conquered. The pattern of war is real. It is documented in the oral traditions of dozens of cultures. It is, in some ways, the most uncomfortable of the three patterns, because it implies that our own ancestors were the killers, that the giants did not vanish through any process of nature, but through the deliberate action of the people who came after them, the people whose blood we carry. And there is an interesting wrinkle in this pattern. In many of the war traditions, the giants are not described as gentle or innocent. They are described as cruel. They demanded tribute. They ate human flesh, in some versions. They took the local women by force. They were despotic. They were tyrannical. The shorter people, in these traditions, are the heroes. They overthrew the tyrants. They liberated the land from a long oppression. Whether this is the truth of the matter, or whether it is the standard self-justification of conquerors who always paint their predecessors as monsters to justify the killing, no one can say. The bones do not speak. The oral traditions, by their nature, are the stories of the survivors, not the stories of the dead. And the dead, the tall ones in the cave at Lovelock, the tall ones in the central vaults of the mounds, the tall ones in the lower stratum at Sumpa, the tall ones in the caves of the Aleutians, do not have a voice in the histories we read. They are present only in their bones. And their bones, as we have seen tonight, are mostly somewhere else. So which of the three patterns is right? The honest answer is that all three are right, in different places, in different ways. The giants of Patagonia probably died of a European disease. The giants of the Sumerian plains and the giants of the Aleut traditions probably drowned in the rising of the sea at the end of the Ice Age. The giants of Lovelock and the giants of Easter Island and the giants of Ireland were probably killed in wars, and in some places, in some times, all three forces probably worked together. A population weakened by disease was then drowned by a flood. A population scattered by a flood was then hunted down by its enemies. A population reduced by war was then finished off by a plague that took the survivors. The history of the giants, like the history of any people, is not a single neat story with a single neat ending. It is many stories, many endings, many small disappearances, in many places, over many centuries. And what is left in the end is the bones. And the bones, in most cases, are not where they should be. They are in storage. They are in vaults. They are in private collections. They are in places that are not open to us. They have been removed from the public view. And the reasons for that removal, whether deliberate or accidental, whether malicious or merely bureaucratic, are not entirely clear. What is clear is that the official story we are told, the story of a world inhabited only by medium-sized people for the last 100,000 years, is not the story that the bones, when they have been allowed to speak, have told. The bones have spoken of something else. A second strain, a different lineage, a taller people, present in many places, who are no longer with us. The bones have not lied. The bones have only been silenced. And we, in the long, quiet hours of our nights, in the small hours when sleep does not come, and the house is quiet, can listen for what the bones, in their storage rooms, in their wooden crates, in the basements of the great institutions, might still be saying. We can imagine them, the femurs longer than fence posts, the skulls with the double rows of teeth, the red hair woven into mats and sandals, the seated mummies in the Aleutian caves with their knees drawn up, the frozen stone figures of Tiwanaku set in place at sunrise, the single great burial in the heart of each Adena mound, 8 feet long, with copper bracelets on the wrist. They are all there. They are all somewhere, stored, catalogued, forgotten, or only waiting. And so, as we come to the end of this long, quiet walk, in the soft hours before sleep, there is no neat conclusion to offer. We have walked through 15 places. We have heard 15 stories. We have considered 3 patterns of how a tall people might vanish. We have looked, briefly, at the institutions that have collected the bones and the institutions that have made them disappear. And what is left at the end of the walk is not certainty. It is something else. It is the simple awareness that the world is older than we have been told, that the world has held more kinds of people than we have been allowed to see, that the bones in the ground, when they are dug up by a railway crew or a farmer or a tenant in a quiet field on a quiet afternoon, do not always fit the story we have been given. And when they do not fit, they tend to be sent away. And then, in time, they tend to be forgotten. But the awareness, once it is in you, does not entirely go away. You walk through a museum and you find yourself looking at the empty cases. You read a small-town newspaper and you find yourself drawn to the older articles, the ones with the strange measurements. You drive past a green hill in West Virginia and you slow the car, and you wonder. You look up at the slope of a volcanic island and you see the figures in the stone, half emerged, half buried, and you wonder. You watch the wind move across the high desert of Nevada in the late afternoon, and you wonder. What is sealed in the side of the mountain? What was sealed there? What has been sealed there for hundreds of years? And whether one day the seal will give, and the wind will reach the chamber, and the chamber will be opened, and the bones, in their long red hair, will be found by someone who has not been trained to send them away, and the story will at last be allowed to come back into the light. It may happen, it may not. The institutions are old, the vaults are deep, the catalogues are large, and the bones, in their boxes, are patient. They have been patient for many centuries. They can be patient for many more. And on the long nights, in the small hours, in the quiet rooms of the world, we can lie in our beds and we can think about them. The first people, the tall ones, the ones who came before, and we can let the thinking become heavier and slower and softer, the way the thinking always becomes when sleep is finally near. The image of a cave in a brown mountain in Nevada. The image of a green hill on the Kanawha River. The image of a beach in Patagonia at sunset, with a man stepping out of the brush, singing, throwing sand. The image of the stones at Tiwanaku at dawn, with the first light catching the carved figures, the figures with their square shoulders and their staring eyes. The image of the long ears in their burning ditch on Easter Island, in the long-ago war whose embers are still warm in the oral tradition. The image of the Aleutian mummies in their dry caves, with the wind unable to reach them, with the cold keeping the shape of their bodies. They are all there, they are all somewhere, and we, in our soft beds, in the warm dark of our rooms, can hold them in mind for a moment, as old friends, as relatives we have never met, as the older parts of our own long story. We can hold them gently, we can wish them well. We can let them know, in the way that one consciousness can let another consciousness know, that they are not entirely forgotten, that there are still people, in the small hours of the night, who think about them, who walk through the list of places where they lived, who say their names: Siteka, Adena, Tongva, Patagonis, Tiwanaku, Long Ears, Waitaha, Sansuna, Fomorians, Waiyug, the first people, the tall ones. And then we can let the names dissolve, the way names dissolve in the moment before sleep, and we can let the images dissolve with them, and we can sink down, down into the quiet, and the warmth, and the long, deep rest that the body has been waiting for. Before we let the night close in entirely, there are a few small things, a few small images, a few small returns to the places we have walked through, that may be worth holding for another moment. The Lovelock Cave in the Brown Mountain of Nevada is, in the daytime, a sun-warmed place. The desert outside it is the color of the back of a hand. The sage smells, in the heat, of something dry and pungent and old. The road into the area is a thin black ribbon. There is rarely any traffic. If you go in the right season, you can hear the wind moving through the openings of the cave from a distance, in a low whistle, like the slow breath of something asleep. The local museum in the town of Lovelock is small. The skulls there are behind glass. Children on field trips press their faces against the glass and look at the long jaws. The teachers stand by and they say what they have been told to say, that the skulls are the skulls of unusually tall Paiute ancestors, that the stories of the Siteka are folklore, that the cave was not really a place of burning, that the bones do not really have red hair. The children listen. Some of them believe. Some of them, the ones who look longer at the glass, the ones who have grandmothers who have told them other stories, do not. They walk out of the museum and into the heat, and they think their own thoughts, and they do not always share them with the teacher. The mounds of the Ohio Valley, in the daytime, are quiet green hills. They are mostly on private property now. Some of them are protected as state parks. Some of them have golf courses built around them. There is one famous mound in Newark, Ohio, that sits in the middle of a country club. The members of the country club play their rounds around the base of the mound. They have done so for more than 100 years. The grass on the mound is kept short. The trees on the mound are pruned. And the central vault, if anyone ever opened it, contained, perhaps, the kind of 7-foot skeleton we have been speaking of tonight, who slept under his country club for centuries, without knowing that the descendants of the people who killed him would be walking over him in their golf shoes, their 5 irons and their 7 irons in their hands, looking for the small white ball. The image is, in a way, comic. In another way, it is unbearably sad. The Catalina Island of today is a tourist destination. People take ferries over from the mainland for the weekend. They walk in the small port town of Avalon. They eat at the restaurants along the shore. They look out at the cold blue Pacific. Few of them, perhaps, know that the island is built on graves. That the brush they are walking through on a casual hike sits on top of more than 800 burial sites, opened in the 1920s by a man who built a museum out of the bones. That the wild bison they sometimes see, descended from the movie cattle, are the only large mammals on the island now, and that the larger ones, the ones the bison would have looked small beside, are in boxes in storage rooms on the mainland, or in private collections nobody has catalogued. Death Valley, the salt flats and the brown hills, has a certain hour, just before sunset, when the light comes in from the side and turns the entire valley a colour that does not exist anywhere else in the world. The salt glows like the inside of a shell. The hills go red and then darker red and then purple. The shadows extend out from the rocks across the floor of the valley, longer and longer until the shadows touch each other and the light is gone. In that hour, when the colours are at their strangest, it is not difficult to imagine a man like F. Bruce Russell walking out of a mine shaft into the violet evening, with what he had just seen in his eyes, with the dust of a tunnel he had not expected to find on his clothes, and with the knowledge that he had stumbled into something the world did not want known. Whether he survived long with that knowledge is a matter of record. He did not. His car was found, his body was not, his tunnels were never relocated, and the desert holds its silence. The trench at Lompoc, on the central California coast, was filled in long ago. The magazine of the military reservation sits over it. The soldiers who work at the reservation today do not know, mostly, that they are walking over the place where, in 1933, a 12-foot skeleton came up out of the trench and was photographed and was sent away and was lost. The old oak trees on the surrounding hills are still there. The Chumash stories about the first people, the cannibals with the double teeth, are still told in certain houses, in certain quiet conversations among the few elders who still remember. The Pacific beyond the bluffs is the same Pacific it has always been. It goes on producing its slow waves and its long fogs. The bones, somewhere, are catalogued or not, are stored or not, are remembered or not, and the rest is silence. The mounds of Wisconsin and Minnesota, the great effigies of bears and birds and water spirits, are spread across the upper Midwest in numbers we no longer fully appreciate. There were once tens of thousands of them. Many have been ploughed under, levelled for farmland, dug up for gravel, scraped flat for parking lots. The ones that remain are protected, mostly, but the protection is recent. For most of the past 2 centuries, the mounds were considered nuisances or curiosities, available to be opened by anyone with a shovel and a free afternoon. What came out of them, in those afternoons, was carried home in wagons, sold to peddlers, given to museums, lost. The bones of the 7 and 8 and 9-foot dead are not all in central institutions. Some of them are in attics, some of them are under floorboards, some of them are in the soil of vegetable gardens, in places where, 120 years ago, a great-grandfather emptied his wheelbarrow at the end of a day's looting and never thought to mention what he had been carrying. The remains of an older world are, in places, very close to us, closer than we realize. Patagonia in the modern era is a tourist destination as well, the deep south of Argentina and Chile, with its glaciers and its blue lakes and its wind that never stops. The descendants of the Tehuelche are still there, in small numbers, scattered through the towns and the rural settlements. They are tall by the standards of the broader Argentine population. They look, in their best photographs, like the kind of people who might once have been even taller in an older generation, before disease and dispossession reduced their lineage. The chains that Magellan put on the 2 men in 1520 are long gone. The 2 men themselves died on the voyage, somewhere in the cold of the southern Atlantic, and were buried at sea. The land of the Big Feet is still there, on the maps. The name Pigafetta gave it 500 years ago still surviving, and the descendants of the people he met, the merely tall remainder, walk through their towns and their cities, and do not always know the full story of why their grandfathers' grandfathers were called what they were called. Tiwanaku, at 13,000 feet on the Altiplano, is one of the most visited archaeological sites in Bolivia. Tourists come up from La Paz by the busload. They walk among the stones. They take their photographs. They climb on the surfaces, despite the signs that ask them not to. They marvel at the Great Gateway, the one called the Gate of the Sun, which is carved from a single block of stone weighing 10 tons. The Aymara, who live in the surrounding villages, work as guides and as vendors of small woven goods. They have learned to tell the tourists the official story, the version that does not mention giants, the version that says the city was built by ordinary men working in cooperation. They tell the official story in clear Spanish, in clear English, in clear French. And in their own homes, in the evening, in Aymara, in front of small fires, they sometimes tell the other story, the story of the giants, the story of the sunrise, the story of the freezing into stone, the story their grandmothers told them. They do not tell it to the tourists. Why would they? The tourists would not understand. And the stones go on standing in the cold wind, and the lake reflects the great cold sky. And what happened in that place, in the long ago, is held by those who hold it, and shared only with those who can be trusted to receive it. Easter Island in the modern era is, like Catalina, a tourist destination, but a much more remote one. The flight from Santiago is over 5 hours across open ocean. There is one small town on the island. There are restaurants, hotels, museums. The moai are everywhere, scattered along the platforms of the shore, scattered up the slopes of the central quarry, lying half buried in the grass at the side of the road. The story of the long ears and the short ears is told, in summary form, in the visitor center. It is not emphasized. The emphasis is on the engineering of the moai, the question of how the statues were transported from the quarry to the shore, the various theories of rolling versus walking. The Poiki Ditch, the place where the long ears were burned, is a low feature on the eastern peninsula that most visitors walk past without realizing what it is. There is a small plaque. It is in Spanish and English. It tells the story, briefly. And then the visitors move on, and the wind moves over the grass, and the bones of the long ears, in whatever shallow graves the short ears left them in, lie where they have lain for nearly 400 years. New Zealand, in the modern era, is a country that has begun, in the last several decades, to take seriously the claims of its Maori inhabitants to the land and the stories. The Waitaha, who are a smaller and less officially recognized group, have benefited less from this shift than the larger Maori iwi. Their claims of priority, their stories of the founding ancestors, remain controversial. There are scholars who argue that the Waitaha tradition is genuine and pre-Maori. There are scholars who argue that it is a late invention, perhaps a romantic response to European contact. The matter is not settled. The forests of the South Island remain, in places, almost as dense and as inaccessible as they have ever been. The caves in the limestone country of the west coast and in the granite country of Fiordland have not all been mapped. What is in some of them perhaps would surprise everyone, or perhaps it would only confirm what certain elders in certain houses have been saying all along. The Gympie Pyramid in Queensland is, as we mentioned, gone. The bulldozer of the 1970s finished it. The farm has changed hands again since then. The hillside is now pasture. Cattle graze on it. The new owners may or may not know what was on the property before they bought it. The local council does not advertise the location. The Aboriginal traditions of the region, the Kabi Kabi and others, are kept by their own keepers, in their own ways. Whether they would, if asked, tell what they know about the older beings, the ones who walked the land before, is not something that can be answered in advance. Some things are not for telling. Some things are for being known, in the way that one's own bones are known, without being spoken aloud. Malta, in the modern era, is a small republic, a tourist destination popular with Europeans for its warm winters and it's cheap flights. The temples are open. You can buy a ticket. You can walk through the entrance passages, the ones that are too tall and too narrow, and you can feel, on your shoulders and on your scalp, the strange sense that the doors were built for a different body. The figurines are in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta. You can look at them through the glass. The fat lady, the seated giantess. The single tall statue at Tartessian, of which only the base now remains, was over 2 meters tall when complete, and the base is in the museum, and you can see the size of the feet, and the size of the feet is, by any measure, the size of the feet of a person who would have been very, very large. The country people of Malta still call her Sansuna. The country people are aging. Their children do not always speak Maltese. The traditions are thinning. But the temples are not thinning. The temples are stone. They will outlast the country people. They will outlast the tourists. They will outlast the planes and the hotels and the bars where the British have their stag parties. The stones of Malta will still be there in 5,000 years, when whatever comes after us is wondering what they were. The Giant's Causeway is also a tourist destination on the Antrim coast of Northern Ireland, one of the most visited natural sites in the country. The hexagons are roped off in places to protect them from being chipped away by souvenir hunters. The visitor centre is large and modern. The story of Finn McCool and Benandut Onne is told to children in animated form. The deeper story, the story of the Fomorians, the story of the older inhabitants who became the underdwellers, is not as commonly told. It exists in the medieval texts. It is read by scholars. It is referenced in some of the Irish literary works of the 20th century. But it is not commonly told to tourists. The tourists hear about the cunning giant who tricked the bigger giant. They do not hear about the older underlayer of memory that says the giants were always here, that we displaced them, and that they have not entirely gone. The wind on the causeway is constant. The sea is cold. The hexagons run out into the grey-green water, and what is at the other end of the road, beneath the surface of the sea, may someday be examined by a sufficiently advanced submersible, and what is found there may, finally, be reported. The Caucasus, in the modern era, is divided among several countries, and several of those countries have been at war with each other within recent memory. Travel is not easy. The high valleys are not casually visited. The villages in the deep folds of the mountains continue to speak their old languages, to tell their old stories, to live in ways that are not much changed from 1,000 years ago. The Nart sagas are still recited at certain occasions. The Wayug still appear in those sagas as defeated giants, as a memory of an older time. Whether anyone living today has seen what the Soviet expedition of 1984 reported finding at Udabno is unknown. The bones, if they are in Tbilisi, are not on display. The bones, if they are in a Russian collection, are not accessible. The bones may by now have crumbled into dust or been transferred to another collection or quietly destroyed. There is no way to know. The mountains keep their silence. The Aleutians in the modern era are, for most of their length, almost as empty as they have ever been. A few of the islands are inhabited, most are not. The fishing fleets sometimes shelter in the bays during storms. The Coast Guard makes occasional patrols. Scientific expeditions, sometimes funded by the National Science Foundation or by various universities, visit certain islands in summer for short stays. But the caves above the high tide line, the ones where the Aleut placed their dead, the ones where the older mummies, the 7 and 8 foot mummies, were stored, are mostly not visited. The Aleut people themselves, the few thousand who remain, scattered across the chain and on the mainland of Alaska, know which caves are which. They keep that knowledge to themselves. The looting period is over. The repatriation period has, in some places, returned the older remains to their original places. The caves are sealed, in some cases, with the original brush and stone, in the manner the Aleut traditions prescribed. The mummies, in their otter furs, in their birdskin clothing, are at rest. The wind comes from the north, the wind comes from the south. The wind comes from every direction in turn, in the storms that move across the Bering Sea and the North Pacific. And in the caves, the cold keeps the mummies the way they have been kept for many centuries. The first people, the tall ones, lying down, sleeping, waiting perhaps for some future generation in which they will be remembered, in which they will be welcomed, in which the long silence into which they have been pushed will at last be broken. Or perhaps not waiting for anything, perhaps simply resting, perhaps by the long, quiet logic of the bones, having become a part of the islands themselves, indistinguishable now from the rock that surrounds them, content in their slow merger with the place that received them. We do not know, we cannot know. We can only sit in our soft beds, in our quiet rooms, on the other side of the world, from any of these places, and we can think of them. We can hold them gently in mind. We can say, to whatever fraction of them is still listening, that they are not entirely forgotten, that there are people, on the long nights, who walk through the list of their names, that the chain of memory, however thin, however broken, however much it has been disrupted by the institutions and the cover stories and the looters and the bulldozers, is not entirely severed. The thread still runs. We are holding it now, in the quiet of this night, in the slow, even rhythm of our breathing. And it will be enough. For tonight, it will be enough. The work of remembering does not have to be completed in a single night. It can be done slowly, gently, in small bits, over many years, by many people, in many places. The work of remembering is not heroic. It is not loud. It is the work of lying in bed in the small hours and thinking, for a moment, of a cave, of a mound, of a stone, of a face in the rock at the bottom of a long slope on a faraway island. It is the work of saying a name, softly, in the dark, before sleep. Sitesa, the first people, the ones who came before. There is one last thought to offer before we let the night close in. It is a thought about why these stories matter, why we should spend a long quiet evening in the comfort of our beds, walking through 15 places where a vanished people may have lived. The bones are not, in any practical sense, our problem. The institutions that store them, or that do not store them, are not going to change their policies because of our nightly reflections. The conspiracy, if there is a conspiracy, will go on operating, regardless of whether we believe in it or not. So why bother? Why think about it? Why spend the hours? The answer, I think, has to do with the shape of the world we accept, the world we are given in our schoolrooms and in our textbooks and in our official histories, is a world in which the past is settled, accounted for, fully understood. The hominids appeared in Africa. They spread outward. They formed the various populations we know today. They built the civilizations we have records of. The story is clean. It is linear. It admits of no surprises. And we are taught to find that cleanness reassuring. We are taught that the world is the kind of place that has been thoroughly mapped, that has been fully measured, that has yielded all of its major secrets to the patient work of the past 2 centuries of science. There is, in this picture, nothing left to discover, only details to refine. But the bones, if the bones are real, complicate this picture. They suggest that the world is not as cleanly mapped as we have been told. They suggest that somewhere in the catalogues of the great institutions, in the bottom drawers of the storage facilities, there are objects whose existence contradicts the official story. And the existence of those objects, even if we never see them, even if they remain forever sealed away, changes the shape of what is possible. The world becomes larger. The past becomes deeper. The story becomes one in which we do not, after all, know everything. There is, in some readings, a kind of mourning in this. The clean, simple world is gone. The reassuring story has been complicated, but there is also, in other readings, a kind of widening. The world is older than we have been told. The world has held more kinds of people than we have been allowed to know. The cousins we have lost are more numerous than the textbooks admit. And when we go out into the world becomes, by this widening, a more interesting place. The mound by the road is no longer a curiosity. It is a tomb. The temple on the cliff is no longer a wonder. It is a building whose architects we have not been allowed to meet. The cave in the side of the mountain is no longer just a hole. It is a sealed place, a place that may, at some future hour, be opened. And the world that contains such places is a world that is still, in spite of all its cell phones and its highways and its satellites, an old and strange world. A world that has not finished revealing itself. A world that we are still, in our slow and stumbling way, getting to know. That, I think, is the value of these stories. They keep the world large. They keep the past deep. They keep the possibility alive that we are not, as we have so often been told, the masters of all that has been. We are, instead, the latest visitors to a place that has known many visitors before, and that will know many more after we are gone. The bones, in their boxes, in their vaults, in their sealed caves, are our predecessors. Some of them, perhaps, are very distant cousins. Some of them, perhaps, are not even cousins, but something else, an older branch of the family that does not quite connect to the branch we know. Either way, they are part of the long story. The story of life on this small, wet planet, with its blue oceans and its slow, circling moon, its single bright sun, its long cycles of season and ice and fire. And in the long story, we are one chapter. The giants, if they were, are another chapter. The chapters before them are others still, and the chapters after us, the ones that have not yet been written, will be others too. We are not at the end of the book. We are not even at the middle. We are at one quiet page, in a long unfolding. And on this page, on this particular night, we have done a small thing. We have walked through 15 places. We have remembered, however briefly, however imperfectly, a people who have been mostly forgotten. We have said their names. We have considered their fates. We have wished them well, in the way that one consciousness can wish another consciousness well across the gap of centuries. And that is enough. For tonight, that is enough. The work of remembering is slow. It is patient. It does not have to be completed in a single night. It can be done bit, by many people, in many places, over many years, and the chain of remembering, however thin, however broken in places, however much it has been disrupted, will continue and will be passed on, and will eventually reach a generation that will, perhaps, be ready to open the boxes and see what is in them, or it will not. The chain may break entirely. The boxes may be quietly disposed of in some future warehouse cleaning. The names may be forgotten beyond recovery. We do not know how the long story ends. We can only do our small part of it. And our small part of it, on this night, has been to lie in the dark and to think of them. The tall ones, the ones who came before, Sitesa, Adena, Tongva, Patagones, Aymara, Long Ears, Waitaha, Kabi Kabi Memory, Sansuna, Fomorians, Wayayug, Aleut First People. Names that the official story has done its best to flatten into nothing. Names that, in the soft hours of the night, can still be said aloud, in the dark, in the quiet, as a small act of remembrance. Names that, even if no one outside our own room hears them, will have been said. Sleep will come. The night is long. The world is older than we have been told. And the bones, wherever they are at rest. As we will be, as we are. Good night.